Hello and welcome to the Startup Operator podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. My guest today is Rory Sutherland. Even saying that feels a little surreal, and it was more than a bit surreal talking to the great Rory Sutherland, who is an advertising legend and among the most intelligent thinkers in the world. Rory is witty, charming, and articulate in a very inimitably Rory kind of way. And that is what you will hear on this podcast. His stories and anecdotes on why persuasion matters, concepts from his wonderful, wonderful book, Alchemy, which talks about how you could benefit from being imaginative and making decisions outside the realms of conventional logic and reason, and why startups should prioritize building a brand. This is a fantastic podcast and one that I will be reflecting upon for many years to come. Do stick around for the good stuff. Hi, Rory. Welcome to the Startup Operator podcast. And it's a privilege and honor to host you. Thank you so much for making the time.
Brilliant. Absolute pleasure. It's an honor to be here. And again, it's a huge pleasure. Big shout out to anybody in Ogilvy, India listening as well.
Yeah, I mean, more than a couple of friends I know will be listening. And I got to say, before we begin with the question, some of my closest friends are in advertising. And, one of the thrills in advertising is when your campaign is on TV or it goes viral on social media. And they've been rubbing it in my face for years now, right? But this right here, talking to you, offsets all of that. So thank you again.
It's a pleasure.
Right. So, Rory, in the 3 decades or more that you've been in the advertising industry, so much has changed with the industry itself. How do you see the attitudes of people itself evolve in this time? Do you think still that they feel that it's some sort of deception that creates no tangible value? Or do you think that they think that, they're more open to the perceived value and the signaling that branding and advertising creates today?
It varies culturally, and what we've created, I think, in Western capitalism is a very narrow conception of value creation, which, as I said in my earlier sort of rant about cooperation and imagination, the value of persuasion in economic growth is vastly underrated. Because the difference between an invention and an innovation is a yawning gap. And for your audience, I'd particularly recommend a book by, it's very easy for me to talk about this because I work in advertising. So to some extent, I'm being self-interested in saying, gosh, isn't persuasion important? But Peter Thiel, controversial, but very, very interesting tech investor. Peter Thiel in his book 0 to 1 makes exactly the same point, which is you can have the best product in the world, but if you haven't worked out a mechanism to enable people to sell it in a way that inspires, trust and cooperation. Okay, then you haven't got a business. Okay. And Thiel also sympathetically makes the point that a lot of engineers look at the frivolity of the marketing department and generally denigrate what they're doing. But Thiel acknowledges that in solving a complex systems problem of human behavior, the job of a marketer is in many cases much more difficult because it isn't even clear what success might look like. If you're given an engineering brief and you say we need to reduce this from 27 milliseconds to 12, you know when you've succeeded. In marketing, it's much more like the 3-body problem, where it's much more difficult to actually, calculate, and where also, the future is always throwing up unexpected, new gravitational forces to affect what you're doing. If you look at something like air travel, during the pandemic, all of the world's airlines had to turn off their pricing algorithms because they were all pricing for a world where if you drop price, it increased demand. And suddenly they found themselves in a pandemic world where the only people traveling were traveling by desperation. And that approach to the world was totally inappropriate. So you've been optimized to a world that no longer existed.
Right.
And those kind of things are happening in markets all the time because they're patently, chaotic systems.
Right. Yeah, in some sense, it's a very unbounded problem that you're trying to solve in marketing
Yeah.
and advertising versus engineering, which is a little more, I would say, deterministic, right, or Newtonian,
Yeah,
as you would put it.
wonderfully put. Yeah, I mean, the problem is actually that one of the ways in which marketers try and justify themselves is they try and create a bounded problem to solve.
Yeah, right.
And they then measure the success of their activity only to the extent to which it achieves the end it was designed to obtain.
Hmm.
And the problem with that is a large part of advertising, and I'll say this right now, is probabilistic. It's essentially fame, essentially is just exposing your upside exposure
Hmm.
to opportunities that you haven't yet quantified or determined.
Serendipity.
And there's a value to fame in simple probabilistic opportunism. You know, a
Yeah,
more famous company will suddenly discover opportunities which a less famous one never will. Now, you can't determine them in advance, but that's the whole point.
right.
And so what we've done is we've created this stupid deterministic digital marketing programmatic world, which, by the way, is part of the solution. I don't denigrate it. I just
Hmm.
denigrate it when it's pursued to the exclusion of everything else.
Yeah. Right. And you brought up digital marketing, right? I mean, there's like a preponderance of data, and we often tend to overestimate the quantitative aspects of things and underestimate the more qualitative aspects, right? So, for instance, I mean, people prefer looking at funnels and data and theorizing rather than, let's say, having conversations with 20 random users, right? How
Well,
can one escape this trap and embrace what you call psychologic, right, where people aren't beholden to sort of conventional reason, and we respect more of the evolutionary imperatives that someone has.
well, if you look at something like a brand, you
Hmm.
patently have to look at its value over time, and you patently have to look at its value residing to some extent in the brains of the customer.
Hmm.
And the reason that Samsung is a great brand is because I have bought a lot of Samsung products, all of which have been quite good. And every time I buy a Samsung product and I find it good, my propensity to buy future products with the Samsung name on increases. Okay.
Hmm.
Now, it's impossible. Okay. You can look at the value of the brand in the level of the individual one off sale
Hmm.
rather than the value of the brand in terms of an ever deepening relationship of trust and assumed quality on the part of the consumer. But if you only capture the value of a brand to the extent that it enables you to sell what you're already selling,
Hmm.
not to the extent that it will enable you to sell extraordinary things in the future, okay, you're insanely undervaluing
Yeah.
what it is to own a brand. The other thing that tends to happen, by the way, is that Samsung will tend to compare its brand value against, say, LG or Sony or Apple. Okay.
Hmm.
But the real comparison is actually, of course, the value between being a reasonably famous company and a company nobody's ever heard of.
Hmm.
That, if you're merely looking at the relative value of the Samsung brand versus the LG brand,
Hmm.
you're only looking at a tiny part of the brand value you're actually extracting from every sale in terms of the ability to premiumize your price.
Hmm. Right.
And so no, it is an extraordinary thing, which is the if you create an artificially bounded problem and you solve it deterministically, because in business what you love to do is pretend you've got a single right answer. If the cost of doing so is you discount all the other value created that lies outside your model,
Hmm.
then to some extent your approach is wrong, because
Hmm.
you're overstating the cost and you're understating the value, and you're making it too difficult for yourself to do something.
Right. In essence, when you build a brand, you're investing in the future, right? And what you are signaling to your users or consumers is the fact that you're going to be around for a while, right? And that they can take a chance on you. They can put their trust in your hands, essentially.
Yes, that essentially, I mean, I often describe the greater part of brand value as being a reliable assumption of non-crapness. It isn't that you think that everything made with a reasonable brand name is going to be the most brilliant thing in the world. No company with the best, with the best R&D in the world, no company with the best quality control in the world can attain that.
Right.
But what you pay a premium for is the reasonable assumption that it is not in that company's reputational and hence financial interests to sell a product that's worse than a certain kind of thing. And I always describe that as the reason McDonald's is the most successful restaurant in the world isn't because it's particularly good, it's because it's incredibly good at not being bad. If I go to McDonald's, I won't get ripped off, the toilets will be clean, I won't get diarrhea, I won't get ill, my kids will all eat the food, I will find the meal tolerably enjoyable, the meal will be tolerably nutritious, okay? All of those certainties are not necessarily present, by the way, when I go to a Michelin 3-star restaurant.
It's less predictable.
No. I've had disappointing meals, and I've had meals that make me ill at Michelin-starred restaurants much more frequently than I have at McDonald's, in fact.
Right.
So I mean, what we infer from a company's sunk cost investment in their reputation is quite often, it's quite often unconscious, and it comes into the field of psychologic, not in the field of logic, because most people do this emotionally. They look at a Samsung television and they go, that'll probably be okay, I reckon I'll spring $200 more to have the reassurance of the Samsung on the bezel. Okay, slight problem with branded televisions, by the way. As the bezels become smaller and smaller, displaying your brand of television becomes harder and harder as a status good. So we have a slight problem there. But I'll pay $200 for whatever it is that provides me the reassurance. And when you look at an unbranded television on Amazon, which is manufactured by Zozongu and which is apparently identical, you feel a vague sense of ease and disquiet. Okay, but we don't actually go through the process of reasoning to understand this. I make a very strong case that mass advertising is essentially more trusted than one-to-one targeted advertising, on the basis that we instinctively know that you can't fool all the people all of the time.
Okay.
And therefore we say, if this company were lying, they might be lying to me very ingeniously because they know I'm a sucker for what they have to sell. The fact that the company is using mass media suggests that they're making a claim which even experts within an audience won't be able to reject or discount. It's why we get married in church, or in your case, in an enormous 5-day ceremony costing tens of thousands. But it's why we get married in front of a crowd. We don't get married by making our vows door to door.
Right. It's a social contract.
And we inherently process information that's in a mass setting differently to how we process information which we think might be targeted at us alone.
Right.
Undoubtedly that.
Right.
And yet nobody can account for this, so they just look at reach and frequency, and the bit that's the medium is the message gets completely ignored because it's exogenous to the model.
It's a social contract, right? When you're putting your name out there. So, we're talking about the importance of brand, but often founders tend to be engineers, right? At least here in the tech startup ecosystem that I work in, right? Founders put off branding or positioning for much later. They assume that, once they become big enough, that's when they have to prioritize this, right? They more or less, sorry, go ahead, please.
So there's no point in actually doing a disproportionately good job unless you have a brand, okay? And the example I always give of those hoverboard things, which were like manufactured in Shenzhen, and then they were branded by the importer, not by the manufacturer, okay? Nobody had a name to say, when I wanted to buy one of those for Christmas, I couldn't decide which one to buy because there wasn't a name there. It was all just Ouija board, duck board, this board, that board, 8-inch wheels, 6-inch wheels, so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so. Now, the only point of making a disproportionately good hoverboard is if the excellence of your product becomes known either to the buyer who will then buy from you in future, or becomes known through recommendation to the buyer's own friends, where he says, well, if you want to buy one of those boards, you should definitely buy the Samsung one because it's better. Okay, without that basic branding thing, there was no incentive to invest in a disproportionately good board because the sales gains would accrue to the category, not to you.
Very
okay,
interesting.
You have no incentive to be particularly good if no one knows who you are. Okay, because there's no reputational reward. Similarly, what happened in the UK is one board caught fire. Someone decided I better charge it up for Christmas Day. so my kid can whiz around on it on Christmas morning. And then they were charging it under the Christmas tree, and it set fire to the tree, and there was some sort of conflagration. Now, we didn't know which brand of board to avoid because they were all called stupid things. So we just didn't buy the category at all. The whole category was killed because the bad news wasn't ring-fenced, and the good things didn't create a positive feedback loop. So without those feedback loops, negative and positive, that a brand makes possible, the reputational feedback loop is actually necessitated by having some sort of identity. Capitalism doesn't work because it's evolutionary mechanism. It's like trying to get evolution without genes. Okay, you without the feedback loop, which rewards customer satisfaction and punishes Christmas tree fires. Okay. Essentially, the whole evolutionary mechanism, the selection mechanism of free market capitalism doesn't goddamn work.
Right.
And yet, bizarrely, this factor, and I said trust, imagination, cooperation, reputation, are all necessary to the process of actually, functioning markets.
Right.
And yet economics ignores this and decides to solve the deterministic part of the problem because it's more mathematically tractable.
Right.
Terrible.
It's more provable, right? So,
because it's perfect in a world where you don't want to be clever, you want to be right.
right.
And, I think that's, and where actually, as long as you've got a good argument for your decision, you'll never get fired.
Yeah.
So most business activity is nothing to do. It looks like it's sort of information gathering and presentation.
Right.
It's mostly arse covering in disguise. I would argue possibly, I think if it wasn't for the urge to cover our arses by post-rationalizing our decisions, I think we could all go home on Wednesday afternoon, to be absolutely honest.
Yeah.
I really think it's that. I really think it's that bad, by the way. I genuinely do.
Yeah, you have a quote in your book. It's easier to get fired for being illogical than unimaginative, right?
Unimaginative,
Yeah. So, which brings me to the book Alchemy, which is a really wonderful book. One of those books that had a profound impact on me, right? And I think the only other book I can think of that came close to that is Fooled by Randomness by your friend Nassim Taleb, right? So, it tackles the root of this problem solving in our culture, which has become very resource driven and bureaucratic rather than accounting for the psychological aspects, as you would call it, right? And calling for more imaginative problem solving. For those who haven't read the book yet, could you lay out the basic premise of the book?
Essentially, the book makes the point that in making decisions in the world, we use a whole variety of mechanisms, many of them instinctive and unconscious, which are logical, but they don't fit very well with naive logic, with a very narrowly short-term deterministic view of the world, where the assumption is that that if you optimize each single shot, what you're doing is optimizing overall. And this idea seems to pervade everywhere, which is that as a result, if you only test and experiment with or consider those things that you can rationalize in advance, your potential solution set will be inordinately narrower than if you allow for imagination combined to experimentation.
Right.
And so the book starts by making the point that actually quite a lot of the world's most successful new brands and products seemed utterly absurd at the moment of their inception. No one would have thought there was a market for $700 vacuum cleaners, and yet Dyson is $1 billion company. Gusto, it's a food delivery company. Again, rationally, it doesn't solve any problem that you could put up on the screen and say, people have asked us to solve this problem. Okay. Red Bull. Okay. If you wanted to compete with Coca-Cola, every rational person would have assumed you needed a drink that cost less than Coke, came in a big can and tasted nicer than Coke. Red Bull comes in a tiny can, it costs a fortune, and it tastes disgusting. So the extent is that there are far more interesting ideas out there that you can post-rationalize than there are good ideas you can pre-rationalize. And yet our business requirement that you pre-rationalize every single aspect of your activity is therefore massively creatively limiting, and probably denies you access to the biggest commercial opportunities that are currently sitting out there waiting to be captured.
So for,
And so it's very similar. I mean, Nassim Taleb's point about fool by randomness is that we have a disproportionate urge to see patterns in things.
right.
What I think also happens here is that when we see a pattern, we don't actually ask for disconfirmatory information. We tend to seize on the pattern, discount everything that lies outside our convenient sense-making model, and then just proceed as though what you see is all there is, or Wiziati, as Daniel Kahneman called it. We just proceed on the basis of, I don't want to know any more, because it might actually disrupt my preconceptions.
Right. Right.
But I think it's hugely important, because I think if I'm talking to sort of tech startups here, there are undoubtedly solutions you could solve by using a behavioral or psychological viewpoint, which
Right.
would at first glance seem fairly irrational or pointless. But the great news about that is, if you come up with a solution to a psychological problem, rather than the logical problem, you'll have much, much less competition than if you come up with a logical solution to a problem. Because the problem with logic is it gets you to the same place as everybody else. Indeed, in many cases, if there were a logical solution to the problem, we would have already found it.
Right. And it's not as simple as building another feature, right?
No.
For your competitors to catch up with you on that front.
No.
Yeah. Right.
And I think there's potential for extraordinary innovation in what I call if you can solve. It's a three-body problem. That's the thing. You've basically got technology and you've got economics, and those are. And when you just consider technology and SI units, and you consider economics and financial units and artificial units like utility, which are numerical and assumed to be linear and whatever it is, blah blah blah. Okay, it's a very nice problem because it's just a two-body problem. The second you add psychology, it's a three-body problem, and it messes up with your effectively what Marx would have called the dominant ideology.
Right.
But actually, there are far more interesting tech innovations out there which could be driven by a psychological insight than there are tech innovations out there which are just waiting for better technology or a lower price.
Right. Any examples or anecdotes
of Uber? I think the principal genius of Uber was the map.
Right.
Which is that waiting, regardless of the price of an Uber, and remember when Uber started, it was actually basically Uber Lux. It was a very high-end cab firm. Right. The thing that made Uber distinctive was that the previous process of waiting for a cab, because the human brain has evolved to hate being in a state of uncertainty, was a kind of anxiety. It was kind of anxiety or, general anxiousness.
Right.
Which we found unpleasant. Now, the fact that Uber, first of all, started by giving you an estimate of how long you'd have to wait before you booked. So you didn't end up booking too early out of, playing it too safe. But also, once you had booked, gave you the live position of the car on the screen. Okay. That very fact, I think, caused people justified taking a taxi inordinately more cognitively rewarding, less cognitively stressful than it was before, and therefore made taxi rides more valuable. Okay, it reduced the cognitive downside and the emotional downside of choosing to go by taxi.
Right. So startups are very experimental, iterative, right, and often have to solve problems not with greater resources at hand, but with ingenuity and smarts, right? So for any of the founders and operators listening to this, how would you recommend? I mean, what do you think that they should do to build a culture of alchemy in their startups?
First of all, borrow from Nick Ridley and look for exceptions, look for anomalies. A lot of extraordinary great tech firms have arisen. Sometimes look for a niche target audience. So I'm always very interested in the extent to which a remarkable number of innovations arise out of, first of all, trying to solve for people with disabilities.
Corner cases, in some sense.
So find that kind of, the extraneous person who has a particularly acute version of a problem. Because one of the reasons Good Grips is the jacuzzi was invented for someone with disabilities. The jacuzzi firm was a pump firm in California. And I think one of the daughters of the jacuzzi family might have had multiple sclerosis or muscular dystrophy, or for some reason needed hot bath treatments.
Hmm.
There's a list of tons of them. I mean, BT created a large button telephone designed for people who are effectively blind, and it became their best-selling phone. The extraordinary case of very, very interesting ideas which were designed for what you might call outliers. That's always interesting because, most of us are semi-disabled part of the time, if you like. So someone with an exceptionally acute need is probably representative of a less acute but more general need, which all of us, even able-bodied humans, also experience. It's rather like wheelchair ramps are pretty useful if you're in a wheelchair. They're also pretty useful at airports if you've got luggage on wheels, okay?
Right.
And so, door handles are mandated in public buildings, I think, in the US and UK, because if you've lost the use of your hands through arthritis or through amputation, you in a fire, you can't open a doorknob, but you can open a door handle. Okay, very, very sensible. But it's also worth remembering that anybody carrying 2 cups of tea has effectively lost the use of their hands.
Right.
And so designing for a niche group with the idea that this might scale more widely is a really, really interesting approach.
So, I mean, it's the start of our financial year here in India, and there's a lot of planning and forecasting that happens around this time of the year. What you're saying with alchemy is such a powerful concept, right? But how does it work in the real world, right? So how do I draw up a plan based on alchemy, for instance, right? So how
one thing to be really alert to is that your people are punished for costs, but they're never punished for missed opportunities. And therefore, the general pattern of people's work and activities is over directed towards billable things. And the interesting thing there is that, looked at through the lens of short-term financial expediency, experimentation will always look like a cost, because some of it of necessity will fail. In fact, if you're not failing, you're not experimenting hard enough. And also the gains to experimentation probably take time to appear, but they can be disproportionately high. And so probabilistically, you have to do what Nassim Taleb calls a barbell. You've got to divide your efforts between exploiting what we already know and what you might call, outlier experimentation.
Right. Low risk, high gains.
I'm very interested at the moment in asking, how could you create a completely new model of consulting using Zoom as a technology where the consulting is collaborative, cheap, highly lucrative, interactive, and virtual? Because McKinsey have a problem. They can only talk to one client at a time. Now, I don't see why we can't do consulting in behavioral science for 10 transport clients who are non-directly competitive, who all turn up simultaneously on some sort of online event, and where they get a considerable cost saving, we get a reasonable amount of remuneration, including the fact that if you record those online events, you can arguably sell them a second time round. Okay.
Right.
This is the potential to reinvent things. And I think, by the way, of all the technologies, there's a problem here because video conferencing is actually about 20 years old. If you get evangelical about it, you look like a lunatic.
Right.
It's like going around saying, isn't electricity brilliant, right? But actually, I've got a hunch that actually we will see a surge in white collar productivity through the widespread adoption and normalization of video conferencing. And the point being, it wasn't that the technology isn't 20 years old. The technology is indeed 25, even 40 years old, if you want to go back longer. What's new is the behavior around the technology.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So if I proposed a Zoom call in 2018, I was the oddball. Okay. I was the weirdo. If anything went wrong with that Zoom call, by the way, I got the blame. I told you we should have gone there by train. Okay.
Right.
If the Zoom call went well, I didn't get any of the credit. It was just, okay, that was all right, wasn't it? Okay. Totally biased incentive scheme. Now you have this, what we're doing now has gone from being Dr. Pepper to being Coke. It's gone from being the weird niche activity that, you wouldn't really ask for because in a restaurant, because it makes you look weird, to being mainstream.
Right.
I always say the magical property of Coca-Cola, okay, thumbs up in India. Although
Right.
Coke and Pepsi's quite big. Okay, you can ask for it anywhere with the reasonable expectation that they supply it. Okay, if I ask for a Diet Coke in a Michelin-starred restaurant in Paris, or I ask for a Diet Coke in a Tanzanian beach shack, I reasonably expect them to have it in stock. And I can ask that question without fear of contradiction or ridicule. That's not
Right.
true of Dr. Pepper. Okay,
Right.
if I went to a Michelin-starred restaurant and said, "I'll have a Dr. Pepper Zero, please," they would go, "We do not stock that, you Anglo-Saxon Mura." Okay, and so you disgusting and vulgar person, you frankly, you're a disgrace to the European continent. Okay, so social normalization of things is probably behind 50% of the value of Coca-Cola. Is its normalization?
Yeah, you make
It's a
the
psychological factor. I mean, their distribution's cracking as well. It has to be said.
right.
Let's give a bit of credit to those guys. But yeah.
Right. No, you make the point about cocktails, right? I mean, if only you could show people what cocktails look like, and what glasses they would come. I mean, people's propensity to order cocktails would increase dramatically.
And I criticize marketers there, because marketers spend too much time saying, how do we make this thing sound great? And they spend far too little time going, what are the obstacles? What are the hurdles we need to overcome before we can make this behavior easy, attractive, social, and timely? Okay, that's the model developed by the Behavioral Insights team in the UK East. There's
Right.
also COM-B, which is capability, opportunity, motivation, lead to behavior. There's a thing called mind space. And these are really, really useful checklists, because they prevent marketers becoming fixated on, hey, isn't this wonderful? Which is what marketers tend to do.
Right.
And they focus marketers on the equally important business of going, yeah, but let's look at solar power for the home. Okay. Now, my big problem with solar power is, I'm sure you can make it work for me economically. I'm sure you can make the panels really attractive. You can probably put them on my roof. Okay. I'm not going to take a $30,000 bet that might not pay off in one shot. What you need to do is to sell me a small amount of solar power so that my car is solar charged, maybe, or my summer house is solar charged, or my garage is charged with solar. And then now I've got that working, I'll think about. So everybody's got solved the economic problem. What they haven't solved is the problem that nobody goes from 0 to 100% solar by
Right.
writing a check for $40,000, because all our instincts are against doing that.
Right. Right. And the subscription economy that you're seeing at this point of time, right? I mean, the $5 per month or $10 per month sort of a billing cycle that you're seeing, that kind of fits in neatly with what you're saying, which is that, hey, if you are going to change your behavior, you don't have to stake everything at
Or
once.
even better as a software model, of course, is freemium.
Yeah.
Which is a brilliant model, because I get to try this. If I decide I like it, I then go, oh, I'll give you a few quid a year to avoid the ads. By the way, try some really weird pricing things. Try like £10 for life. Okay.
Right.
Offer people a wider range. Don't just make it monthly, because I think we're running up against a limit of monthly subscriptions.
Right.
Try some really interesting things, which is like, try a gambling pricing, which is pay £5 for this, you get lifetime use of the product, and if we hit 1 million users, we give you £20 back. Okay. Try an early bird, early adopter pricing strategy, which is actually has Dishoom, the Indian restaurant chain in London I mentioned.
Yeah.
They have a few times of the week where they're a bit quiet. Typically Wednesday lunchtime in an Indian restaurant in London is going to be a bit quieter. So we said, well, you could do a discount on Wednesdays, which is at 16% off, but that's boring. So what happens on Wednesdays at Dishoom is they bring you a dice, and if you throw a 6, you get your meal for free.
Oh. Right.
So now what's interesting about that is, if you know that in advance, you're not going to skimp on your meal, are you? Because you look a bit of an idiot buying the really cheap options and everything if you ended up getting your meal for free. So it's going to encourage you to spend more in a way that 16% off doesn't.
Right.
Now, no supermarket in the world has tried that.
Right.
And I think that, if I were younger, I'd start a lab now that looked at innovative pricing schemes, innovative incentives for the early stage growth of tech companies. And by the way, as I said, if they're I don't want you're in India, you're a startup. I don't want to charge you Ogilvy's day rate, right? Because you've got a business to run, right? But if anybody listening, if you want to get together in a group of 10 and say, we've all got these problems, can we have a bit of Ogilvy behavioral science? And, you each pay us, 80% of, 8% of, the standard hourly rate. We get 80% of what we normally pay, and we don't have to fly out anywhere. So there are no transport costs. Let's make that work, because I'll give you an example of this, of something that's never tried, and I'm giving this away for free. I don't know why I'm giving it away for free. I should make money out of it. Okay. I've never seen a recommendation incentive that exploits scarcity bias. Actually, I have. I've seen it in things like Clubhouse, and I've seen it in the original start of Google Mail, where you were given a limited number of invitations. But mostly what credit cards like Amex do is they say the more people you invite, the more we'll reward you.
Right.
But I think if you said you're only allowed to recommend one person every 2 months, I'd think really, really hard about who I'd want to invite and recommend. And that way I'm doing unbelievably sophisticated targeting for you.
Right. So you're building snob value.
I've never seen that. I've never seen that done. I've seen it done with Clubhouse, which is just, hey, I look like a bit of a mensch if I can invite my friend to Clubhouse. Right. But I've never seen it as, okay, if you recommend 10 people, we give you an amazing reward. But the deal is, you can only recommend one person every month. Okay. Right. And then let's say you did that with Gusto, okay, which is my food delivery service. If there are any British listeners here, it's fantastic, and it's very, very good for Indian food, by the way, because I'm a total convert. Okay, most British households love Indian food, but there's usually 2 niche ingredients, like fresh coriander or something, the omission of which kind of ruins the overall sensation, because it's a highly sophisticated food.
Right.
And we either don't have them in stock, or we don't want to turn our house into a spice rack. So Gusto works brilliantly for Indian food because it delivers exactly the ingredients you want in the right proportion, which also nudges you into making the meal, by the way. I've got cookbooks. I've got an Ocado account, so I can order my groceries. There was nothing stopping me doing this for the previous 10 years. I never did. And so, but anyway, if you look at that thing, which is you can recommend one person a month, and then essentially, if you recommend 10 people, you get a year's worth of food for free. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
That could be absolutely transformative, and no one's tested it.
Right.
So something really, really interests me there.
Yeah. No, I wonder why people aren't more creative, especially when they look at utilization of fixed assets, right? Like airline tickets or hotel rooms, for instance.
Don't get me started. I know. Because the marginal cost of actually having a person in a hotel room is very small.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, one thing nobody's done, and the airline industry hasn't done it, is, okay, do you have any hotel people listening? Okay. Family room half price, or stay at our hotel, book 3 rooms or 2 rooms for your whole family. If the hotel isn't free, we'll give you one. If it isn't full, we'll give you one of those rooms for free, right? Who wouldn't stay there with those nice gambling conditions, right?
Yeah.
And not only that, maybe we won't give you the room for free. We'll give you a voucher equivalent to the value of the room to spend on your next stay. Now, how do you beat that, right? Nobody will. Okay, in direct marketing, we always knew a third of the value, roughly, it wasn't a third, but a third of the value was in the targeting, a third of the value was in the creative, and a third of the value was in the offer. We get a lot of people doing targeting. We get a lot of people doing creative. We don't get anybody designing offers. Now, okay, let me explain why this is a good idea, right? Okay, do you have any kids?
No, not yet.
Not yet, okay, don't worry. When you have kids, one warning, get your luxury hotel stays over with early, okay? Because if you and your wife or girlfriend, who are both earning a salary, okay, stay in a hotel, you're paying for 1 room with 2 salaries. The second you have kids, and if the mum has to stay at home because the kids are young, or at least is working part-time, okay, you're now paying for 2 rooms with 1 salary. So a 2-star hotel for a family is actually more expensive in terms of the perceived pain of payment than a 5-star hotel for a dual income couple. And similarly with air travel, I've never seen airlines, instead of dropping the price per ticket, why don't airlines just say this flight's underbooked, we'll make it kids go half price? Okay, we won't discount to the business traveler because they don't give a shit what they're paying because they're not even paying it. We'll just discount to families who we know aren't there, and we'll offer them kids go half price and use that as a form of yield management pricing. Okay, why would that work? Because every person with a family would have to go to your website to see if there are any good family bargains on offer.
Right.
Now, with the hotel, that I think is how the Holiday Inn chain got started.
Right.
The guy who founded the Holiday Inn chain, interesting story. He was actually Elvis's first manager and sold him to Colonel Tom Parker, and would normally have ended up as like the saddest person in the world because he sold Elvis, right? But in the end, he used some of the money to co-found the Holiday Inn hotel chain. I don't know why Holiday Inn doesn't tell you this, right?
Right.
I mean, you're basically you're the hotel chain created by Elvis. I mean, geez, right?
Yeah. What a story.
What a story. Okay. But they started, I think, with the second room was half price. And for some reason, they just lost it. And they just lost sight of it. But that's the maddening thing when you have kids, because, you're either forced to all cram into a room, which is a bit like, I mean, you're staying in a hotel, you want a treat, not an experience of slum living, right?
Right. Right.
And nobody does this. Instead, they drop the price of all their rooms, so a dual income couple are getting a bargain, which they probably don't even care about.
How much of this problem
I mean, if you
is
think about it now, if you look elsewhere, McDonald's has the Happy Meal, right? KFC has the bucket. They've all solved this problem, which is basically the more calories you buy, the less you pay per calorie, because we know that families are more price sensitive than individuals are. McDonald's also has wrap of the day, which I don't know if they have but that's also a brilliant price discrimination idea.
Yeah.
But you take it to the train, the train industry or the hotel industry or the travel industry. It's the same idea. It's, McDonald's, Burger King, they've been doing it for years. Tim Hortons, the more donuts you buy, the less you pay per donut, right? But the hotel industry hasn't cottoned on.
How much of this is because, marketers and advertisers have this tunnel vision, I mean, they don't really respect the one Mises principle, as you mentioned, that the food is as important, if not more, I mean, as important as the cleanliness of the floors and whatnot, right? I
think marketers, to give marketers their due, not all of them are very good. Okay, let's be honest. Okay, but there are marketers who are brilliant. I mean, the best marketers I meet are just, a whole realm of, genius. If you've got the best 10 marketers in a room, you could solve, a large chunk of the world's problems. I've always thought.
Right.
But they're frozen because they're seen as a fluffy discipline. They're frozen out of problem definition. And the problem is always defined in non-marketing terms before it arrives at the desk of the marketer to solve.
It's defined in sales terms, basically.
Or even worse than that, is defined in economic manufacturing logistical terms. It's defined as as essentially a deterministic single solution closed order problem.
Are you surprised, or are you sort of fascinated by the revolution in B2B software, right? The amount of marketing, advertising chops that people tend to show these days. Zoom, for instance, we spoke about Zoom and other sort of B2B software, right? I mean, they've really caught on because I think marketing innovation or advertising innovation was typically restricted on to the consumer side of things, but B2B tech, has made a lot of strides over the past decade, especially.
And I suspect that India will end up being a B2B powerhouse as much as a consumer powerhouse, by the way. And by the way, Zoom is a very important complementary good here. And understanding this concept is valuable, which is one of the things I said to Transport for London and my former colleague, who's now an advisor, is I said that actually you're looking at Uber as if it's competition, but maybe it isn't. And this is what I mean by the ecosystem mentality. I went to Diageo and I said, actually, I think these boutique gins aren't competition. They're brilliant news because they make the whole gin category, in which you have two mega brands. Okay. They just make it more vibrant and exciting. Okay. Previously, you couldn't really have much of a conversation about gin. I prefer Gordon's. I prefer Tanqueray. Okay. Now, all these boutique gins suddenly normalize gin consumption on occasions where Gordon's and Tanqueray weren't even getting a look in.
Yeah.
And I was a bit uncertain about saying that because I said, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they'll end up suffering. And I spoke to someone who'd been in the gin category at a large spirits manufacturer, and they said, no, it turned out you were dead right. It was a dream working in gin. You know, because you get people coming to you and saying, we need to have a gin strategy for our, you know, our event, you know, that kind of thing, which never happened before. You know,
Yeah.
it just, the whole voltage of the category was transformed. Okay.
Right.
And that's what I mean by ecosystem thinking. Now, in transport, one of the things I said is that Uber is very good news for public transport because it's complementary to public transport. They go, no, what do you mean? If you take an Uber journey, by definition, you're not taking a public transport journey. And I said, one, bullshit. Because I live in Sevenoaks and nearly all my Uber journeys are to a tube station or to a train station. Quite a lot of them are last mile journeys. Okay. You know, okay. It's, you know, right. That's the first point. Secondly, the reason I didn't drive into London in the first place was I knew that in the worst case scenario, I'd always be able to get an Uber to the train station. And if that failed, because I, you know, fell asleep or something, I'd always be able to get an Uber home. And so I was much readier to take the public transit journey into London, this is pre-lockdown, knowing that in the worst case scenario, there was a private sector solution to get me home. Whereas in the previous scenario, if I missed the last train, I was sleeping on someone's sofa, you know, I was going to have to crash, right?
Right.
Now, looking at things through the lens of a complementary good, Zoom is very, very complementary to B2B. For the simple reason that in order to make a sale in B2B, okay, you're probably going to have a chat. Now, what I discovered pre-lockdown as a very early Zoom adopter, you can't sell over email, you can't sell over the phone, okay, but you can sell over Zoom, basically. You can sell quite large projects, you know, quite things of quite high transactional value face-to-face over Zoom with a bit of PowerPoint, with a bit of this. Okay. Now, what that means is that the presumption in B2B that face-to-face contact is a necessary pre-stage to any kind of transaction is basically unsafe. And when that assumption changes, everything else changes because the whole ecosystem has changed.
But do you think that Zoom can sort of replace the business meeting in some sense? Because I mean, enterprise, especially in complex enterprise sales or whatever, right? I mean, half the reason you show up there is because to show that amount of TLC or the sort of, it's seen as an investment, right? In the account.
Equally, one other way we show a bit of TLC is by having more senior people present in the meeting. Okay. And so it is worth noting if let's say we are doing a project with a company in India, okay, right, you know, and let's say the project's worth $100,000 US, okay, by the time you've flown me out, okay, that's your profit gone. But I can attend 3 1-hour Zoom calls as the vice chairman, okay. So you know, these things, these swings and roundabouts. The second thing is that we're in danger here, rather like fooled by randomness, we're in danger here of disproportionately weighting what is visible and salient and underweighting what isn't. And you've got to remember, yeah, okay, this call, right, what we're doing now isn't as good as meeting face-to-face, right? Okay, you know, to be honest, it's not that bad, okay?
Yeah.
But the other thing to remember is that if this meeting were to have taken face-to-face, there are one of two possibilities. You'd have to wait for me to go to India, which might take 6-8 months, maybe even a year. Or the travel cost would have been, you know, 4 figures in US dollars. Okay. So the likelihood is this meeting would never have taken place at all. So this is a case where we're in danger of accounting for the cost, which is it's not as good as a physical meeting, but we're completely blind to the opportunity cost, which is the number of meetings which now might take place. Right. I was on a call the other day where there was one guy in Miami, there was one person in Bozeman, Montana, there was someone else in Delhi. Okay, that meeting would have taken 2 years to organize and would have cost $20,000. Never going to happen.
Right.
So what we've got to do is we've got to be intelligent here and say that yes, there will be aspects to face-to-face meetings, but the one-day flights to Frankfurt really ought to go. It ought to go for environmental reasons. It ought to go for all kinds of reasons. It ought to go just for personal health reasons.
Yeah.
Don't forget as well, okay, that it was slightly different before, because one of the reasons people were flying to Frankfurt is if you had a choice between another effing day at the office or a trip to Frankfurt, you might choose to go to Frankfurt because you can get pissed in the lounge, you can have a bit of a, you've got a bit of an expense account, maybe you get to stay in a hotel, maybe you get to wander out and have a meal. Yeah, it might be a bit of fun, okay?
Right.
When the choice is go to Frankfurt or spend the day at home, rather than another day at the office, or spend the day down at my flat in Deal, where I've got a little flat near the seaside, actually Frankfurt's not looking quite so appealing anymore, is it? Right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If it's spend a day or stay in Spain because it's sunny, or go to Frankfurt, then the comparison set's changed, hasn't it? So, I mean, no, I think we're in danger of underrating Zoom simply because of essentially using a spurious comparison set.
Right. So you've been an early proponent of Zoom and video communication, remote work, and a bunch of these things, right?
Yeah.
And
not because I think they're the answer to everything. And by the way, I wouldn't have made a year's lockdown my experimental set. Okay, I was in favor of flexible working, not house arrest. And this is not a natural experiment, okay? What is extraordinary is the only bit of the experiment that I mean, we're all a bit sick of this now, right? But the only part of the experiment that was meaningful was really the first 3 or 4 weeks before we started to get sick of it. Because I never proposed that everybody stayed at home. I never proposed that you weren't allowed to go into the office. I never proposed that you had to be at home, that you couldn't go to a cafe, that you couldn't go and visit your parents. Okay, none of that was part of the deal. It was flexible working. And and it was one day in the office, one day at home, one day in the office, one day at home. What I never proposed, this is testing it to destruction. But even so, the fact that it's worked as well as it has done, which is it hasn't led to mass suicide. I mean, that's a worthwhile data point, by the way. And suicide under lockdown has bizarrely slightly declined. So at least that's something. Okay. Okay. The fact that it hasn't led to mass collective insanity is significant. Now, there are groups for whom it's been extremely, extremely unpleasant. If you're in a dysfunctional flat share, you're in a bad marriage, if you live alone, on the other hand, this is absolutely suboptimal. You need the office to escape in some cases. And so I wouldn't claim it's been equally good for everybody all the time, but it's been quite good for a lot of the people a lot of the time. And we shouldn't discount that.
Oh, yeah.
We shouldn't just go back to the status quo ante.
I think we should preserve the optionality.
I'm terribly sorry. We preserve the exactly that. And Nassim's brilliant on that. The value of optionality. That there's a value to optionality which is hard to quantify. He has a London friend, which isn't me, who says, by the way, you're in London on Friday. I'm having a party. It's a drinks party on Friday evening. Feel free to come along. And Nassim says that has an inordinately higher value than I'm having a dinner party. Do you want to come along? Because in the former case, I've gained an alternative option. And in the latter case, I've been required to engage in a commitment, because if you don't turn up at a dinner party, there's a bloody empty seat, right? And there's an uneaten meal.
Right.
And so that distinction of do not lose optionality and freedom simply through adherence to social convention seems a perfectly reasonable observation to make. I'm just going to warn you, I've got to go in about 2 minutes because I have got a 4 o'clock call here. But this has been an absolute joy. We'll give you a last question.
Yeah, my last question, your closing thoughts on, what the future will look like. I know it's a very broad question and you could perhaps talk about it for hours on end. But, for all of the founders, operators listening to this podcast, what will the future look like and how should they prepare for it?
Really interesting question. I would say that you have a population in a emerging market country who are incredibly well educated and speak English to an astoundingly high degree. Okay. Where suddenly your location, and by the way, location has all sorts of meanings there, because, your location and modes of payment have been de-geographized. You have to look at this as a massive opportunity.
Right.
And the second opportunity is the opportunity to own the brands under which you sell, rather than selling to brand owners. In general, I would say.
Right.
And The third thing is that to consider the fact that Zoom does for service industries and service businesses what Henry Ford did for manufacturing.
Right. All right. This has been
A degree of what does this mean with a high degree of open-minded optimism is entirely warranted for the next year or two, I would say.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, Rory, this has been a fascinating conversation, perhaps one of the best conversations I've had in recent times. Thank you so much again. I mean, it's a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
You have a great day. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, then don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite platform and share this episode with all of your fellow startup operators. Also, follow the Startup Operator on LinkedIn and Twitter for more updates. Stay safe, take care, and see you soon on a brand new episode of the Startup Operator.